And like Michael, I always love to look out and see all the love that's there. There was a man from the north who was traveling. Kay, can you get the sound?
Yeah, oh, yes.
You're still there.
You were so there, Kay.
I was on the lights.
You were so in the light. There you go. There was a man from the north that was traveling in the south. I'm being fixed.
Sound check.
Sound check. Sound check. Thank you. All right. We ready? There was a man who was traveling in the south from the north, and he came into this small town, and he drove through the town square, and here was this absolutely magnificent life-size nativity scene. And they had the shepherds and the sheep and the cattle and the baby Jesus, and everything was there. And he looked off to the side, and here were the three wise men. And instead of having crowns on their heads or turbans, they had firemen's helmets on them. And he thought, this is strange. And so he took the car and he kind of ran around to see, just to take another look at it. He thought this was really strange. So as he was departing from town, he stopped at the local 7-Eleven to find out what was going on and to get a cup of coffee. And he got his cup of coffee and he went up to the gal at the counter and paid for his coffee. And he said, your nativity scene that's in the center of town is absolutely magnificent. It's beautiful, but I just don't understand one thing. Can you tell me why the wise men have firemen's helmets on? And the gal looked at him and she said, you northerners, you never understand. It's because the wise men came from afar. Oh. Don't grow too What I want to share with you this morning is the presence that the wise men brought to the nativity and the metaphysical meaning behind all that they brought to that experience. And so to begin with, I want to read to you from Matthew chapter 2, 1 through 12. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the day of Herod the king, there came Magi from the east to Jerusalem. And they were saying, where is the King of the Jews who has been born? And we have seen his star in the east, and we have come to worship him. But when Herod the king heard it, he trembled, and all Jerusalem with him. So he gathered together all of the high priests and the scribes of the people, and he kept asking them, where is this Christ child who would be born? And they said, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written in the book of the prophet, even you, Bethlehem of Judea, you are not insignificant in the eyes of the kings of Judea, for from you shall come out a king who will shepherd my people Israel. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said to them, go and inquire very carefully concerning the boy, and when you have found him, come back and let me know, so that I also may go and worship him. And when they heard from the king, they went away, and behold, the same star that they had seen in the east was going before them, until it came and stood just above the place where the infant boy was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly, and they entered the house and saw the infant boy with Mary, his mother, and they threw themselves down and worshipped him, and they opened their treasures and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Common to many of our nativity scenes that commemorate the birth of the baby Jesus or the Christ child are 3 wise men and 3 camels. Now it's implied that there were 3 because of the gifts that were brought, and yet the scriptures do not tell us exactly that there are 3. What Matthew does not tell us, and I would also say that Matthew is the only one that talks about the Magi of the four Gospels. It's the only one that shares with us the story of the wise men who came. Who exactly were these wise men from the East? We can make some assumptions about them, but we don't really know exactly. Some think that they were a group of priests from Persia. Others believe that they were astrologers from Babylon. Others even call them by name: Malachar, Gaspar, and Balthasar. But how many were there? Because there was no actual number that was even given. We make the assumption of 3 because they brought gold and frankincense and myrrh. It only mentions 3 gifts. And yet the quality of the gifts that were brought does not indicate the quantity of the givers. And just where exactly did they come from? Some say Persia, others say Arabia, others say Ethiopia, and according to some, it's just in the East. For the most part, however, historians believe that the wise men came from Persia. And just what was the nature of this star? How did these wise men connect the star with the birth of the King of the Jews? Had they been taught by the Jews of the dispersion to expect the Magi, or the Messiah rather? Had they been given special revelations from a God yet not recorded in the scriptures? The facts are that the biblical record says little about who these men actually were. Perhaps because the actual emphasis was that they came to worship the Christ child. It's easy for fact or fiction to be taken as fact. All we have to do is look at our recordings of U.S. history, of World War II, to understand that fiction gets mixed in with fact. We have seen what people have done with the story of Jesus' birth, and they make the number of the wise men 3 just because of the gifts. And now, remember when I said or the way the scriptures read, it said that they visited him in the house. And that's a huge clue. And yet most of us, we see nativity scenes, and there stand in the stable the 3 wise men. Yet what we ultimately know is that the wise men did not arrive in Bethlehem at the time of the birth. The wise men, however, are a splendid example of spiritual diligence and faith. Just consider, if you will, what it took for them to get there. Now, so typically we see cards with 3 wise men on camels coming across the desert. Not hardly. It was very dangerous back then to travel across the desert. So more than likely the wise men came in caravan. And that caravan would have included an army of about 300 men to protect them so that nothing would happen to them as they came. And of course, when you traveled in caravan, you came with all of your servants, you came with your cooks. The tents had to be set up and taken down, and certainly they would not travel every day. There are some estimations that it took the wise men 2 years to travel the 1,000 miles to actually get to the baby Jesus. And they traveled at great cost and great risk to find this child. So just who were these foreigners who came to worship the child? Now the Bible calls them the Magi, and we know them in America as the wise men. And they were from the east, as the Bible noted, east of Israel. We do think that they were astrologers, people who studied the stars and interpreted the signs that the stars gave us. And in a land east of Israel, the Magi saw a royal star that marked the coming of Israel's Messiah. The term Magi is ultimately a Persian word that refers to a special class of priests in the Persian Empire. That's why we think that they were from Persia. We know from other sources that the Magi had existed for hundreds of years before actually the time of Christ. And we do believe that they were Zoroastrians, which was a religious group that believed in both a good God and a bad God. And they had their own priesthood. And they also appear in the book of Daniel that they existed in his day because Daniel was put in charge of them or appointed to be in charge of them by King Darius. We also know that typically Magi, or the priests from Zoroastrians, were professors and philosophers of their day. They were brilliant and highly educated scholars who were trained in medicine, in history, in religion, in philosophy, and astronomy. They were also trained in astrology. Now, in our day, astrology kind of gets a bad rap. But in the beginning, astrology was connected with man's search for God. The ancients would study the stars to try to answer the questions, who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? What is it that God wants me to do? And there's most assuredly a difference between astronomy and astrology. Astronomy is the science of the study of stars. Astrology is the belief that there is a connection between the positions of the stars and our lives and our human destiny. The Magi were experts in both astronomy and astrology and came to be able to predict the future. The important fact for us to know is that they were highly influential in Persia, and they were probably, in fact, advisors to the king because of their understanding of the stars. Finally, they were men who thought deeply about life, and consequently it is perfectly legitimate to call them wise men. So for us who are religious scientists, what do these men represent metaphysically? And all that they brought to the Christ child. East has always been an indication of our inner consciousness. These men were guided by their inner consciousness to follow that star, to come 1,000 miles, to spend thousands of dollars to be able to come and celebrate the birth of this child. As religious scientists, we are constantly taught and reminded to trust our inner voice, to trust our intuition, because it is Spirit speaking to us. The Magi represent all the wisdom that we carry from lifetime to lifetime. Because we have assumed for years that there were 3 wise men, it is important to look at the metaphysical significance of 3. Body, mind, spirit. Omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience. All divine attributes of God. It also stands, 3 also stands for divine perfection. If you look at the charts in the back of the Science of Mind textbook, you'll all notice that there are 3 sections within the circle in the charts, and they can stand for seed, soil, plant, or spirit, soil, or spirit, soul, body. And of course they brought 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. All 3 represent the inner resources open to this new Christ child. Let's first take a look at gold. First and foremost, it represents the richness of spirit. Jesus was certainly filled with the richness of God, of the divine. And it indicates that we, too, can change our mind with wise and rich ideas. Last week, Reverend Michael talked about how sometimes we get great ideas and yet we don't follow through on them. And then all of a sudden somebody else comes along and steals our ideas. Our ideas are gold if we only trust them. There's a consciousness of the omnipresent richness also represented by gold. And all that we create in our life is filled with the divine richness of substance. Now, what is frankincense? Well, it's a fragrant gum resin that comes from trees in Africa and Arabia. Frankincense was used in holy anointing oil with which priests were consecrated. That's why we also think that the Magi, or the wise men, when they came, that was one of the gifts they came with, because they knew this child was representative of the divine. Pure frankincense at that time was poured upon the sacramental bread within their temples of the wise men. Now, frankincense was the emblem of divinity, and frankincense represents our ability to transform our material consciousness into spirituality metaphysically. And just how do we do that? Through our spiritual practice on a daily basis. I certainly notice a shift within myself when I don't spend time in my prayer chair, and it also represents the beauty of spirit. The last gift that was mentioned was myrrh, and this too is a bitter tasting aroma gum resin that was used in incense and perfumes. It is interesting to note that it was one of the oils that was used on the body of Christ after his death, to prepare it for burial. Myrrh represents eternality of the spirit. It is also an ointment of love. We can see how symbolic metaphysically these three gifts that the wise men brought to the baby Jesus are. There may have been other gifts, but these were not recorded. Remember, Matthew was a book that was in the New Testament, and that was the only one that mentioned the Magi, and it was written 80 to 90 years after the birth of the Christ child. And of course, we think that the writer was a follower of the disciple of Matthew. However, we don't know what got lost or what was fabricated in the process of writing it. So much of the information that we may need to know more about this story of the Christ child, about the wise men coming, may have been left behind. Now, the star that the Magi followed to find Jesus and is also part of this important story. Who among us has not gone out at night and looked up in the sky and seen the gorgeous and the beautiful formations of the stars? Or when we were younger, we always went out and we'd look for the first star of the night and we'd make a wish. We'd make a wish upon that star. And the interesting part about that is that metaphysically, the star is that ability within ourselves to accomplish and create what we want in our life. So when we go out and we wish upon that first star of night, we're actually following through with customs that are thousands of years old. A star also represents our own intuition as well as the awakening of man. Certainly we know that Jesus came to awaken all of us. Now, the baby Jesus was born in Bethlehem. I had the honor or the chance to visit there about 4 or 5 years ago and actually see the birthplace of Jesus. And Bethlehem means house of bread. Interesting name. And when we look at it further, we understand that Bethlehem was a place of substance. Beth in Bethlehem then metaphysically becomes the center of man. Love and wisdom there are united into one. And Christ is brought forth as the substance within each of us. You've heard all of us as ministers talk about the Christ consciousness that lives within you. This last week, a friend of mine and I were reflecting upon my preparation for today's lesson. And she wanted to know, well, what are you going to talk about? And I said, metaphysical meaning of the three wise men. The star that they followed. The journey that they took. And we started to talk about the places we had each journeyed in our lives on account of the Christ child. All on account of the Christ consciousness that lives within each of us. And we realized that in our journeys we had been into jails, into prisons, into soup kitchens and hospitals and nursing homes to take the message of love, the message that the Christ child brought. We had all visited slums throughout America. I can remember I'd always volunteer as a teenager to take the food baskets into the low-income homes at Christmas and Thanksgiving. Or then for 3 years I spent in a HUD housing project in Long Beach working. We had visited Medjugorje together and walked in the footsteps of Jesus in Israel. We had stood in vigils and walked in marches and practiced civil disobedience sometimes. And both of us had visited churches of many denominations in tiny towns throughout America and different kinds of sanctuaries of all shapes throughout the world. All on account of this child and our desire to grow closer to the oneness of the divine, the presence that lives within, and to understand the message of love if we only open our hearts and our minds to it. As we talked, we marveled at the pull he had had on the course of our lives, and we marveled at the places to which we had been and we had been taken, and we were glad and ever so grateful. We had followed that star to the Christ child to find our own path to love, which each and every one of you can once again renew and do in the days to come. And what we realized and what we shared with each other is that once we have traveled that path, there is no turning back. There is never a possibility of returning home exactly the same way you came. And it's not possible to meet that child without remaining unchanged. This last week I received a message through the internet from a friend of mine. And if you open your program, you'll find a little place or a little saying there that says, Christmas blessings. Should be in everybody's program. Does everybody have a copy? Would you go get the extra copies? Who doesn't have a copy of it? Would you get- Raise your hand if you don't have a copy. Make sure that everybody gets a copy of it. Just really felt that this was such a beautiful saying that he had written, that I wanted to share it with you today. And the more I thought about it and the more I prayed about it, I realized I didn't want to read it to you. I wanted to read it with you. Because this is about the presence of Spirit within all of us. So let's read this together. Let me be mindful of my words and their impact upon others. Let me be aware of the power of forgiveness to free myself from the past. Let me live my life as a source of healing energy for all. Let me live life from a constancy of gratitude. Let me always free others to be where they are, not where I might want them to be. Let me nurture pure and beautiful intentions that bless others, and let me keep my attention upon that cause alone. Above all, let me honor this journey of life, so when I step across to my eternal home, I bring only one story, the love story. And so as you begin the week here of love, take these thoughts with you to your family, to your friends, as you celebrate the presence of the divine in all of you. This is the truth in my life, and this is the truth in yours, and so it is.
And so it is.